Squared Radio. We're coming to you live from an undisclosed location east of the Appalachian Mountains. My guest tonight is Neil Kramer. I want you to become part of the program tonight. It's a lively discussion. We've laid the groundwork, and trust me, we're going to get into the meat of this, and you're going to understand what's going on. Anywhere in North America, and it's 888-429-5471, 888-429-5471. Anywhere else on planet or off planet, you can reach us at 530-413-9537, 530-413-9537. Don't forget, we have our digital conference line. If you want to step out and listen to us by Bluetooth, it's 805-399-1000, 805-399-1000. When you get there, put in this passcode, 769-608-pound, 769-608-pound. Let's pick up where we left off. Neil, we were talking about Barack Hussein Obama and the fact that his hands also are not clean when it comes to indiscriminate, I'm going to call it, killing of the innocent. You know, the alternative media scored a huge victory last week with the joint coverage of the U.S. government's purchase of over 1 billion rounds of anti-personnel hollow point ammunition. And the ammunition is to be used domestically, not by the military, not outside the U.S. These are agencies inside the U.S. Several factors are possibly at play. Citizens have been purchasing firearms and ammunition at an unprecedented level since 2008, right after the election of Barack Obama. It is clear to the American people that unelected forces that are not under the control of citizens are wielding undue influence over the federal government, even to the point of breaking the law and violating the time-honored principles of the U.S. Constitution. And some people that at some point citizens who are dedicated to preserving liberty as encapsulated in the Constitution will rise up to depose the shadowy figures lurking in the background, as well as their puppets, robbing taxpayers of billions every day without remorse. These circumstances, when added to the growing economic crisis in Europe, China, Japan, add up to a potentially dangerous scenario where global civil unrest becomes commonplace. We're seeing it in other countries. We're seeing it in Egypt. We're seeing it in Yemen. We're seeing it in Syria. What's to stop that kind of unrest from happening here in the U.S.? Well, countries we're not even at war with, we're flying drones over them under the orders, direct orders of the president, and we are killing civilians in the streets, in schools, outside hospitals, outside churches. What's to stop those 30,000 drones that are going to be flying over the United States from carrying weapons and doing the same thing to us? What do you think, Neil?
Well, I think that there's an argument to say that if we've all got our Remington shotguns and our AR-15s and our Glocks and stuff, that they're not going to be much use against super advanced technology. That's true to some extent, but on another level, having everybody armed creates an enormous logistical problem. You can't just wipe out 300 million people. It doesn't work like that.
No, and I can see large volumes of Bud Light being put up for the first person that shoots down a drone with a 30-06.
It's that's very funny. It's a social issue. It's a social issue, and it's a matter of perspective. I mean, for a lot of British people, I mean, I've lived here for 3 years now. Before that, I'd lived in Britain all my life. I'm pretty well travelled. I've been all over the globe. Like yourself, Brooks, I know that helps if we put our philosophical hat on. You learn from the things you see. You expand your consciousness from understanding other ways of doing things. So living in America has been personally really good, but kind of philosophically very fascinating because I've learned lots of things. One of the things I've learned is that gun owners are not what they were depicted in European media on the BBC and so on. Some men and women in America take it upon themselves to own a firearm, to learn how to use it and to obtain the relevant paperwork and whatnot. If they're fortunate enough to live in a state with constitutional integrity, who have the shall issue policy, which means that unless you're certifiably a deranged nutbag, you will get a permit, then those men and women may choose to put themselves in a position where they would be prepared to use deadly force to protect innocent lives. These people are called gun owners. And there are millions of them, millions of good, balanced, excellent human beings who are what you might call sheriffs of freedom, security, and well-being. And American citizens have the right to do that. The deceptive corporate media, CNN, ABC, CBS, NBC, distort that fact and depict gun owners as socially isolated, smelly, survivalist, illiterate dirtbags. Now that notion has to go. In my experience, it's simply not true. And so there is a very foundational problem in what we consider gun ownership to be. And what a gun owner, what kind of person is a gun owner? Are they all beard-wearing people in camo combat trousers, smoking cigars and, comparing rifle lengths or whatever? There are some people like that. There are some expos and conventions where you can meet those guys if you like, but 40% of new firearms sales, I understand, in the last few months, last quarter, have been to women. And they don't often get depicted as gun owners. And I don't mean kind of, if you forgive the expression, crazy trailer trash women. I mean all kinds of women, young women, professional women, attorneys, doctors, mothers, school teachers, bus drivers, crossing guards, whatever. A lot of those people are not what you see when you associate the images on the television with your mental, personal picture of what gun ownership is. And it's the same with how the stories are put forward as well. So you don't often see positive gun stories, stories where guns save lives and make bad things not happen.
No, in fact, it's very difficult to get those stories in the press where a robbery is thwarted or a rape is stopped or a child is saved from abduction because somebody local was armed. You don't hear about those stories very much.
I have to say it was you're absolutely right. I have to say though it was very encouraging to see here our little farty media outlet KGW in Portland, who do a decent job, to be honest. They reported just last month an excellent little story where a woman was walking in a Portland park, just right where I live, with her 6-year-old son, and a man approached her aggressively, started masturbating and telling her that she should watch him, and, the woman, very surprisingly, pulled out a Ruger 380, pointed it at the guy and said, "You've got 5 seconds or I'm going to shoot you." And the guy ran off. And police are now investigating the man, not the woman, as they would do in some backward countries. Like if you did that in Britain, the woman would probably be in prison now. And she is helping to identify this guy from mugshots because he's been involved in another series of disturbing incidents. She's helping to catch the guy. She protected herself and she protected her 6-year-old son. But that doesn't fit with the corporate media message that private gun ownership is bad. See, private gun ownership can also prevent crime. Regular people with guns sometimes stop bad things from happening. And that doesn't fit with the message. And even very recently, that dreadful excuse for a human being, I have to say, Piers Morgan, I'm so sorry you have to get subjected to that man, Brooks. He's so awful. Now, Piers Morgan was interviewing John Lott, who wrote a book called More Guns, Less Crime, which uses a lot of hard data to make the case that the average crime rate goes down when normal people have guns, right? And he gave him such a hard time, Piers Morgan, that it was noted by a lot of viewers who took action with that. And amusingly, they're trying to deport him. They're getting a petition to send to the White House to deport this terrible man, Piers Morgan, for proposing unconstitutional ideas. And what's even funnier is that the UK people who've cottoned onto this are preparing a counter-petition to say, we don't want him back, you keep him. This is a man that people do not like. He's not intelligent, he's not funny, he's not aware, he's epically uncool. He's just not a real person. And so that is not the sort of place where you should be having an evening dialogue about gun control with somebody so horribly uninformed like Piers Morgan. And that's the problem, that there's very few places where you can get a fair, clear, and honourable discussion about these matters. It's so massively skewed that it's difficult to have the conversation, even for people who say, look, I don't know what the answer is, I don't know what all the solutions look like, but I'd certainly like to dialogue on this. I'd like to discuss it. I have some concerns and I also have some ideas. Where do those people go to do it? You know, they don't all have the confidence to step up and stand up and put the hand up and jump on the blogs or the radios or whatever. And so people are just scratching their heads and reading newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post, who are hugely pro-gun restriction.
Well, you know, I quoted from Mr. Florida earlier, where he's a writer for several of those publications that you just mentioned, and he's an economist, and he's acting as a social statistician. Now, you don't want to do that with another statistician, because I can pick your numbers apart and I can see what he's doing. When he takes states that have strict gun laws and say that they have less gun violence, it is not because of their gun laws. In fact, before and after cases have been made very effectively, statistically, from before and after gun regulations were put in place, or when gun regulations were reversed and actually concealed carry laws were improved and allowed people to carry guns. In every single instance, an armed populace resulted in lower gun violence. Florida is a classic case. Florida had very, very strict gun laws, would not allow, they called it possession of a weapon with the intention of going armed. That's what they called their law. And what was happening is people were getting carjacked right and left on a regular basis down in Florida. It almost made the news every single week. And so they revised their gun laws to allow Floridians, to law-abiding Floridians, to carry guns. Violence disappeared. Their crime dropped by 75%.
Mm-hmm.
There was another town called Morton Grove. Morton Grove outlawed handguns, required people to turn them in or lock them up. You were not allowed to possess them, and if they found them, they were going to confiscate them. Crime went up 50%.
Mm. Yeah, well, I think you have to, whenever you hear statistics that are skewing the picture, one way or another sometimes, frankly, you have to take note of that, and you have to question who's giving those statistics and why. And I would have to say that as a philosopher, it is clear to me from a rational and philosophical point of view, the idea that guns are the core problem with shooting sprees is an absurd thing to say. They are no more responsible for those kind of crimes than a pen is for the work of Shakespeare. It's the same thing. It's not about the hardware, it's about the mind. Not any external hardware of any sort whatsoever. It's about the mind. And that mind, whoever it is shaped by family, community, education, and culture. Those are the four empowering factors, one way or another.
Yeah.
So when we start to talk about guns, we often overlook that, and that kind of false thinking starts to make an enemy out of guns, knives, batons, sticks, martial arts, fire, water, all kinds of silly thing. And ultimately, the very earth itself becomes an enemy, something that can just harm us. And that's an unspeakably foolish way to think that, okay? So whoever they are, whoever these people are, who want to go into the real roots of these mental disturbances, like our guy Adam Lanza, the Connecticut shooter or whatever, we have to go into why is that family and community, why is that education system and that culture failing to encourage the mind? Why is it not doing that? And as we've said, let's not pretend that at the top level, the people who want guns out of the hands of the general public are aware that guns are not the problem. They know they're not the problem.
Well, they have another agenda. They have something else in mind. They want to tip the scales.
We might know that, but not everybody gets that. And they shamelessly exploit these situations as if taking weapons out of the hands of free, innocent, good men and women will somehow stop disturbed people behaving badly. It wouldn't. The Columbine thing happens slap in the middle of the assault weapon ban. It doesn't work like that. A better and more meaningful measure would be to restrict the sale of certain computer games if you really want to go to the root of it, as the NRA recently said. Not that I usually massively agree with what they say, but you can't watch a game like Grand Theft Auto or Saints Row or whatever, where you basically go around as a thug, murdering people, beating people over the head, shooting old people in the face, running people over in cars, blowing things up, going into shopping malls with assault rifles. Those are games that millions and millions of young men, mainly, play all over America and Europe and Africa and Asia. That generates more disturbance than the existence of any sort of piece of hardware. So a meaningful act would be to have the military cease glorifying violence in its recruitment campaigns, or to have sportsmen stop worshipping violence and venerating undisciplined aggression as some sort of sign of masculinity. But those things are never called into question. To have super violent films, which are utterly devoid of any nobility or substance, taken away from young minds, might make a difference. You'd have to do it very carefully. It might make a difference, right?
Oh, definitely.
I don't mean informed adults. I mean little kids who are 6 and 7 years old who there's no reason why they should ever see that. Now, not in the sense of moral censorship, because I'm absolutely against that, but just to give a young mind a reasonable chance to decide for itself whether to imbibe that kind of media or not, from a place of sort of informed consent. And the NRA did point out the very important statistic just in that press statement that the guy Lapierre gave out. A child growing up in America today witnesses about 16,000 murders on a screen before they reach the age of 18. And as many people know, what you experience emotionally on a screen isn't massively different from what you experience emotionally with your eyes right there in the room in front of you in real flesh and blood. So that is more worrying to me than people who choose to own little pieces of hardware. That is much more worrying to me.
Well, yes, of course, but when you see actions, official actions by, I'm going to call it the agency government, and we do have politicians that will jump on the bandwagon too, especially if they think they can, garner a few more votes out of it, because their agenda is to try to get the populace disarmed, because they know
absolutely no question about it.
There are writers, I'm going to call them propagandists, in the press and in some of these agencies where these secretaries are causing these position papers to be written and published on the Federal Register, that believe that the biggest enemy to world peace is an armed American.
Well, what can you say about that? I mean, it's, not a lot.
Not a lot. Most everybody that I know in America is peaceful. In fact, when they're assured that their household is secure, Americans get even more peaceful. It's when we feel that we're exposed, when we feel we're defenseless, when we feel a federal agency encroaching into our daily lives, shutting our restaurants down, invading our service stations and our grocery stores and our schools. That's when we feel vulnerable. That's when we get on the defensive. That's when we stop trusting those people that we've elected in public office and the armies of bureaucrats that stand behind them.
Well, it comes back down to what are those guns for? What are they for? And one answer is that guns protect free, balanced individuals from criminals and from government. And if you, as we said earlier, if you believe that your government has your best interests at heart and that the police will always be there to save you in the case of an emergency, then you don't need a gun. If you don't think we're quite there yet with either of those two scenarios, then a gun can be very useful. To put it as simply as possible, if you have any bad guys with guns, then you need good guys with guns too. And I know that's a phrase that gets thrown around a lot, but you can think of those people as, independent sheriffs, as I said before, acting for the security of themselves and the families, but also for the public as a whole. So when we say good guy, I'm defining good as an honourable and balanced human being, and I'm defining bad as a dishonourable and imbalanced human being. And I think that those two things are quite universally understood. Unfortunately, we have many dishonourable and imbalanced people in government who are determined to disarm the population, and that must never be allowed to happen. Now, one day, when dishonour and imbalance have been taken out of our statesmen and are no longer considered as attractive property in a statesman who wants power, then we can put our guns away. And until then, we will keep them so we can defend the freedom of the state. And it's as simple as that. It's not about toting these things. It's about what they represent. Nobody wants to be running through the streets shooting people. That's not something that anybody really wants to see. What we want to see is that some countries who have a codified written constitution stick to it, and they evolve it simply in small refinements and small iterations through the people. And as Clint Eastwood did a poor job, in my view, of his talk for Mitt Romney and stuff, but he made a very important point, which is let's remind ourselves that the president is the ultimate servant of the people, and the government is an organisation who is elected to serve the people, and the power rests with all of the people. That is not just something that people say in high school and then forget. That is actually the way it is. And if that starts to slip away, then the very last thing you do is give away your symbols of power, which are weapons, right?
Yes.
You may never need to use them, but you need to keep them because they symbolize something very important. As soon as they disappear, it's a marker on the long-term strategy that the people have given up. Even if you never, ever take that out of your lockbox or your nightstand drawer or whatever, it doesn't matter. If you give that away, if you have some sort of armistice or moratorium and everyone just gives them back and the police say, we won't ask any questions, but let's take these out of circulation, you have given up on what freedom means for a state. And I have to say, and I've said this in a number of places, I still consider America to be the freest place that I've ever visited. And I've visited many places in Europe. What keeps America free is that even amidst this tyranny and all these awful things that Alex Jones tells us about, it's still a place where most people consider themselves as their own boss. That isn't a popular view elsewhere in the world. Most people are all too ready to give over their power to someone else. So although you might see nutty people speaking for guns, like Ted Nugent, who I secretly quite like, what he does show us is that nobody's the boss of me. And it can come across as a bit cheesy, that, and a bit silly at times. But philosophically, that's a very, very, very important point. And actually, he communicates it rather well.
Yeah, I think so. And Americans are peculiar in that respect. That's part of our national heritage. It's part of what we grow up doing. I mean, when the first compact was signed and the first ships came over, they were supposed to land at a specific area that had been, contracted in that compact. But when they got there, the water was muddy and it was infested with mosquitoes. And they said, we don't really like this place. Can we sail up, the coast a little bit? And so they did, and they landed, what's Boston today, because the water was clean and the beaches were nice, and it was much cooler and the beaches were more accessible. But in doing that, in their minds, what had happened is they had stepped outside the contract with the king. And they'd already declared their independence. They said, wow, hey, since we're on this dirt up here instead of that dirt down there, technically we're on our own. We could make our own wealth. This doesn't belong to the king. And that's what became America. That's what became America. But now, here we are, some 300 years later, and we have this government that was created by an aristocracy in 1932. It's now been around for 80 years. And in that 80 years, from president to president, some more than others, they have been empowered to grow and to establish their own laws and their own right to tax and their own right to regulate and seize property and throw people in jail and file lawsuits. And when an agency of our government begins to draw too much blood, they will sacrifice one of their own. This week, Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Lisa Jackson announced Thursday she is resigning from her position. Now, according to reports, Jackson is leaving before an investigation can be launched into the agency's alleged illegal use of private emails for official government business. Are you freaking kidding me? This is an agency that has laundered hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayer money to illegal purposes, dark projects, presidential campaigns, giant corporations, global national billion-dollar trusts, all taxpayer money. They have been responsible for literally the biggest bank heist in history. And she's resigning because she emailed one of her best friends on government email system? You got to be kidding me, Neil.
Yeah. Somebody's just gone over to a desk and said, hey, you're out. Say whatever, but you're out. And that happens all the time. And I think anyone who takes those posts realizes that's a potential thing. As I said before, it's all about context, this. If you labor under the liberal political illusion that the government is doing its best in very difficult circumstances and cares about society, then she's resigning because she's done something foolish. Then we don't need guns because we can trust the agencies to protect us themselves. We don't need to do that. That's for someone else to do who is sort of trained in that. But when you call 911, if in my apartment building where I live here, if there was a shooting in this building, if somebody calls 911, why do they do that? They call 911 because they want to fill out witness reports or have the cops discuss the matter with the perpetrator, or to go over points of law, or to arrange for anger counselling. No, they call the cops because they have guns and they will kill the bad guy. They call 911 because they want someone to shoot somebody, right? Afterwards, do we want to disarm the cops because the bad guy was killed by them? No. But to me, that's no more ludicrous than suggesting we should disarm general law-abiding population in that sort of situation. So we have to sympathise, of course, with people who were involved in the Sandy Hook shooting, but you have to put it into context. You cannot ever trust the media to do that. Every day in the US, about 46 people are murdered, right? That's about 0.00001 of the population. And admittedly, on December the 14th, just over half that daily average occurred in one place at the same time, right? That's unusual, but not statistically unheard of.
Yeah, but so it's rare.
To put that into context, since the Sandy Hook shooting, a further 690 people have been murdered in the US, right? None of those murders really get any sort of corporate media attention because they don't fit the narrative of disarmament. They're not sufficiently sexy. People get
they're
killed,
usually
whatever.
One criminal shooting against another criminal. But let's be real here. Far more Americans have been killed. Innocent Americans have been killed by troops and law enforcement than by a crazed shooter. You know, Ruby Ridge, Waco. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And you have, crazy government officials and rogue cops that are shooting innocent people or gang-on-gang violence. But these, crazies like Columbine or Sandy Hook are very rare. They happen, once every 10 years or so.
Yeah.
But it gives these agencies the ammo that they need. I mean, let's not even talk about Fast and Furious, where they pumped a couple thousand weapons over the Mexican border. 3,000 innocent Mexicans lost their lives with those weapons. Yes. Yeah. They didn't say anything about that. Nobody went to jail over that. What kind of disarmament program is that?
And that's what you have to do. You have to detach one confused item from another. So law has very little to do with prevention of violence. Laws do not discourage disturbed people from doing stupid things. Let's say Adam Lanza shot those 26 people, which I have doubts about. Let's say that because he was 20, he was not legally allowed to own a firearm in Connecticut, right? Neither was he allowed to bring those guns on school property. Do we think that by restricting semi-automatic rifles or limiting magazine capacities that would stop somebody like him doing that again? No, it has no influence. They're not interested in the law. They are clearly making an internal decision not to take any notice of the law. Making more things illegal means nothing to disturbed people, nothing at all, because disturbed people will always find a way of expressing their disturbance, and if that means he's going to mimic what he's played on a computer game, maybe that's what he's going to do. If he's been picked up and programmed, maybe that's what he's going to do. But the official story tells us that the guy stole his mother's legally obtained firearms. How do we use the law to prevent that from happening? You can't. Disturbed people will do whatever they want. Writing something in a legal book that says people are not allowed to do X, Y, and Z does not apply to disturbed people at all.
Yeah, and I've always maintained that no politician is going to move against the Second Amendment. They're not going to start gathering up firearms. There's no way the National Guard or the UN troops in Colorado are going to go door to door saying, we understand you have 7 firearms registered, we're here to pick them up. They're never going to do that. What they will do, and the Constitution doesn't really specifically say anything about this, is they'll limit ammunition. Yeah. And I already discussed the legislation that they're trying to do to prevent law-abiding people from making purchases of ammunition online without reporting it to the sheriff's department. But I see them going after specific calibers of ammunition and approving, say, a government round and saying that only the government can have that particular round of ammunition. And then they'll take reloading equipment and they will consider it terrorist contraband, that you're actually engaging in terrorist activities by making your own ammunition. This is the kind of move that I see going. Because I know lots of people that own guns, but they don't own much ammo for it.
Yeah, well, that's why it's very important to distinguish between the violence of a disturbed person and the existence of a certain piece of hardware. That hardware has very little to do with it. Although there are no guns in Britain, Britain is one of the most violent places in the civilized world that you could possibly visit, right? Now, you might not get shot in the face, admittedly, but you might get a kitchen knife in the top of your head. And, what's worse, to kill someone with a rifle or a knife or a hammer? Is it easier to kill someone with a kitchen knife than a rifle? Probably it is, yeah. They're more accessible, they're easier to use, easier to conceal, and they're devastating at close range, whatever. I think it's wise for us to acknowledge that statistically the amount of people killed with semi-automatic rifles is barely noticeable. More people are killed with knives and hammers and screwdrivers and bare hands and poison out of the, under the kitchen sink. It's not the hardware, it's the mind. A gun is essentially a little tube that fires a piece of lead out of one end of it. It's not evil, it's not bad, it's not wrong, it's not immoral, it's a totally neutral thing. Marksmen use it to put holes in a piece of paper. Hunters use it to kill animals that they eat. Soldiers use them to kill other soldiers, right? It's the minds, not the hardware, that we should be concerning ourselves with. So when anyone does move to restrict ammunition or guns or whatever, you have to say, well, we understand that the hardware's not the problem, so we're not supporting the removal of that because that does nothing to solve the problem. That's the first step. You have to say to people, that's not the problem, so don't move to do that. People like, God, what's the name of that one? Dianne Feinstein.
Oh, yeah.
What is it?
Feinstein, you got it.
Feinstein. Dianne Feinstein is not helping, right? She is a Democratic senator, once, I believe, mayor of San Francisco. She is not interested in making life better for normal people. She isn't. So every time you see her say stuff about this, we can all tell, if we put our hands on our hearts and just examine what she's saying and doing, we can all tell that what she's concerned with primarily is status, power, and wealth, right?
Sure.
Not the welfare of the rabble. She's not interested in social justice or intelligent politics. She couldn't care less about that. This is the very last woman you want debating guns, or Joe Biden. Never a more obviously crooked character has graced the political stage, and yet he is being positioned to put in powerful new legislation that will change firearms ownership in America. They're the last people you want involved in this. We mustn't trust them because they're wrong. They're not honourable people.
Well, but we have seen our legislation take some nefarious turns in the last 20 years. We've seen the Patriot Act. We've seen the National Defense Authorization Act.
Oh, yeah. It's not party politics. This is one unified strategy that goes across. It's never about being Democrat or Republican or liberal or progressive. That's irrelevant. It's nothing to do with that at all. It's to do with a single unified imperial strategy to get everyone in line. And one of the markers for that is gun ownership. Who has the guns? If it's just the authorities, then you've given up. So you have to look out not only for these people, but also the corporations who support that, like Time Warner and A&M Records and actors and celebrities who speak out against guns. Some of them, admittedly, from ignorance. They're not trying to do anything strategically clever. They're just horribly uninformed and hypocritical, and they like to say the politically correct thing. Although privately, many of them think and feel otherwise. I know that for a fact. So we can ignore what celebrities say about guns. It's not relevant on the whole. There's some nice exceptions to that, but on the whole, hearing actors say guns are bad, let's take them off the streets, no kidding, we all know that, but that's not the point. That is simply not the point. So we have to understand that the problem is not one of hardware, it's one of minds. And if those minds are getting disturbed culturally through corporate-sponsored media, that does more to correct the problem than anything at the other far end of that process line. So the problem's caused, you have a disturbance, that disturbance seeks to express itself, person does stupid thing, right?
Yeah.
Whatever is available at the end of that, where it's the person does stupid thing stage, they're going to take it. And arguably, if I ran into a mall with a samurai sword, I could probably do a lot of damage, right? The problem with a rifle is as soon as you fire it, everyone scatters. So you've only got about 30 seconds before it's hard to find people because they all run off in cupboards and stuff naturally. There's a million ways. Throwing poison in a water supply, that's miles more effective. It's not about the hardware. So when we see the television say, let's take the hardware away, we have to say, no, that isn't the problem, so we're not going to do that.
Well, we've been focusing on crime and criminal activity and even antisocial and, we'll say, mentally ill behavior. But I don't think that's really the worry of the agency government. I don't think that's the worry of, like you said, the imperial
that's the
government.
line, though, isn't it?
Yeah. The worry is, the plan is, the agenda centers around the idea that government, the agency government, is going to go a little bit too far very soon. Either the money supply is going to collapse, or they're going to say, okay, China, we're not going to pay back our debt. We're just insolvent. We're not going to pay it back. Here's a vintage package of Twinkies. We're now paid in full. And what will happen is our economy will collapse. And I think what the government is pointing to is a period of civil unrest. And what they want to do is make the civil unrest controllable. They want to herd people into camps. They want to push people around with water cannons. They want to order people with bullhorns to go back into their homes and, go back to the mall and, behave yourself. They don't want to see a new kind of Occupy America take the streets, one that's armed, and not just a little bit, but maybe 100 million Americans taking to the streets with guns. That's what they don't want to see. And I think that's what they really think could be a reality.
I think you're right. I think if I was putting myself in their shoes and I was sat in one of these think tanks figuring this stuff out, organising Britain will be relatively straightforward because there's no armaments or whatever, and there's an extraordinary reliance on the media, not for conscious people. Some of the most awesome individuals in the universe are in England and the British Isles. Conscious people always break the default programming, whatever it is. So we're not on about our kindred spirits, shall we say. I'm on about mainstream people who choose not to think for themselves. Those people in Britain are easy to control. Those people in America are a little less easy because, as I say, there's only 300 plus years of history. So that pioneering spirit, which separates itself out from the nightmare of monarchical government in Britain and Europe and France and Germany and Spain, is fresh in the collective sort of DNA of these people, in particularly North America. But of course there's other places, the South America, Canada, other places, but let's focus on North America. It's fresh here, and people have an instinct. The hairs on the back of the neck stand up when somebody tells them too much what to do. So the clever interplay of right-wing, left-wing politics just polarizes that, where the left-winger, what do we care, we're all smoking dope and playing our guitars and dreaming about holding hands. And the right-wing are all sort of Rush Limbaugh, and we've got our guy here, Lars Larson and stuff, who are just kind of old-school right-wingers who say some interesting things but are kind of like living in a slightly different universe, in my view. Neither of those two places we're going to find solutions with this. The solution is largely about community and independence, because if you have lots of independent communities who govern themselves, that's an impossible task. You don't want that. So you don't want people who are informed, armed, self-sufficient, self-sustaining, have power, physically, resources, gasoline, solar, electricity, this, that. That's too difficult. So you have to create a dependence. So for the next 4 years, that is the goal of the Obama administration, to create extraordinary dependence where people are can't give enough stuff away fast enough to say, look after me, Daddy, because I can't do it on my own.
Well, I was wondering, every time I come to this level, and believe me, I've managed some pretty large events for weekends and even a summer. And when I see people that are dependent like that, like, where's the bathroom and when do I eat and can you please put the food on my plate for me and feed it to me? I've been in those situations before, and it's a little aggravating, for the ones that are running the event. You want people to be independent. You want them to be self-reliant. Why, and this is a very important philosophical question for a philosopher, why would a government or a ruling class want to make the vast population totally dependent on them for their daily bread? Why wouldn't they want them to be productive and to get out of their hair and to, give me some breathing space? Why wouldn't they want them to be independent?
Well, even in the Tao Te Ching, which Lao Tzu wrote a long time ago, he says that essentially people don't want to spiritually attain enlightenment. They don't want to ascend. They don't want to evolve. They just want to be happy, right? They just want to have a nice time and have some nice things that make having a nice time easier, right? And that is the case the world over. That's changing a little bit, but that is still the case the world over. People would rather have a nice time than do the right thing, or embrace their sovereignty. No one's interested in that. Or embrace their freedom, or express their divinity. All those things are removed from the mainstream conversation. The mainstream corporate media conversation, which is entirely funded by gangster capitalism, is to say you are only interested in your own personal happiness, and you might buy some vegetables that are grown locally, and you might give some money to little kids in Africa to have fresh water now and again. But on the whole, it's all about your personal happiness. And that's a very clever technique to say, forget the happiness, but it puts consciousness only to one's own advantage. And people start to think only of themselves, and they live a very self-possessed kind of life. Not self-reliant, though, not self-determining, just very self-obsessed. And when that happens, community starts to fall to pieces, right? In Portland, it's not like that. People here, for whatever reason, I think it has something to do with the land of California and Oregon and Washington. There are a number of cities that I visited, Seattle and Portland being the two most obvious, where that's not the case. Community rules. People aren't massively interested in what's going on. They'll vote locally sometimes for various things, but the community works, right, because there's a specific population size that doesn't go too up or down from year to year. When that industry radically changes that supports the population and encourages it to balloon, like in Detroit, say, when that goes away, you get a serious problem, right? A serious problem. So I would say Detroit is similar to Birmingham in Britain in that it once had a very proud industrial heritage with a lot of phenomenal working class people there. But the population ballooned, had enormous unconscious immigration strategic programming by government to undermine the social and ethnic existing characteristics of what was there by dispersing it knowingly and unhelpfully to any race or any ethnicity. It's not about one over another, of course. And now you end with serious problems. So when you do have an economic pulling the plug situation, Portland will do quite well. That's not why I live here, but Portland and cities like Portland will do all right, okay? It won't be nice, but they'll do okay. Places like Detroit will have enormous, enormous problems. Where I used to live in Queens in New York, that infrastructure can barely support itself in a relatively healthy situation that it's in today. It can barely support itself. It is physically and psychologically falling to pieces. And people are starting to reflect that in their own lives.
So the structure of these mega cities, as Richard Florida was talking about earlier, the fact that we only spent 2.5%, and I think we only have two cities, he said, that are even in the top 15, which is Atlanta and Dallas.
That's right.
On infrastructure, and infrastructure, they mean trains, bus systems, subways or elevated rail systems or monorail systems or airports. And it's probably the two airports, Dallas and Atlanta Airport, that probably gave those two cities their high rating in the first place. And what they lauded, what Richard Florida lauded on this television program where I played the audio, is the fact that China spends 9% of its budget on infrastructure. And that's because when you have 1.2 billion people that don't have cars, they need a way to get to the factory. And they work in the factory, and they live in the factory, and they eat in the factory, and they're clothed by the factory, and they're jumping off the top story of that factory and killing themselves in the parking lot because they're not happy.
Just before they finish making the latest Apple Mac product, of course.
Yeah, the point I'm trying to make is, Neil, that happiness comes from that self-determination and that freedom. Absolutely. It comes from that freedom, from that liberty. And when that is taken from us and our day is scheduled down to the last minute, we jump off the building.
We do, and that's the key point, that freedom is where true happiness comes from. It doesn't come from having a 300-inch plasma screen or 7 Mercedes or whatever. If you enjoy those things, great, good luck to you. Do what you can and have a nice time. but it comes from being able to determine your own agenda and your own weekly and monthly and yearly schedule, right?
Yeah, but we see a whole society like that. They have the big screen TV. They've got the new BMW. But can they quit their jobs? No, they can't.
Well, that's right. And that's what's beginning to change, because those sort of megalopolises or whatever, those huge metropolitan areas, the deal is, if you hand your schedule over to a corporate entity or to even just a small private ownership or whatever, but something else, if you hand your schedule over to another agency, let us say, then you can have some nice things, right? That's the deal. And that fundamentally takes away part of the human natural ascendant impulse, which is if you're looking at a schedule that you're not very happy with, where you're doing something maybe that you don't really believe in, and you're going to do that until you're 70 now, realistically, then that's no good. That isn't living. That's not life. That's not what people want to do anywhere, anytime, anyhow. Those who do it out of necessity to support families do it under heavy exploitation of their psyche, right? So it's a strategic exploitation, and it's a total deception.
Sure.
And even in the enlightened parts of Britain and America, people simply ignore that. They know that that's the case, but they ignore it because you want your nice Toyota Prius, or you want your new iPhone, or you want this, or you want that. All that stuff is built completely and utterly on this paradigm of class-based, value-based, economic-based
happiness,
dominance, and submission.
Yeah. That is where happiness comes from.
Yeah, and the only way you can attain real happiness is by correct function, which is growth. Human beings come to Earth to grow their minds, their spirits, and to articulate that in the universe. It's like a reciprocal energy exchange between, this is a little bit metaphysical, but I don't think your audience are scared of this. The universe is evolving, we're evolving with it, and it's a team game. You do it with the universe, and that's when we're doing our function, right? And it's a beautiful, brilliant, sublime, exquisite function. It's the function that everybody loves and would love to do. If you're living against that function, if you're living the opposite of that function, then the only happiness you get is from sedation of booze and sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Nothing wrong with that now and again. We all like a little bit of that. It can be fun. But if that's your only shot at happiness, look at Charlie Sheen. It doesn't work. It's not enough. Happiness isn't that. That's just a bit of fun, a bit of frivolity. That doesn't fundamentally fulfill or satisfy a human being. Winning millions of dollars on the lottery won't solve the problem. The problem is controlling your own schedule, and that is easier to do in a certain kind of community where there is a stable population size, where people know each other, and where there is a natural diversity of consciousness, right? So sometimes you might be lucky and you might see that in an interesting city like Seattle or Portland or whatever, little community places. But you're not going to see it in New York very much. You're not going to see it in Los Angeles very much. You'll see pockets of it, yeah, but not a lot, because that infrastructure is purposefully designed to stamp that out, right? Because the schedule is
in some cultures, like Japanese culture, it's called a nail sticking up is hammered down. That's
right, yeah.
Which basically we're talking about wooden floors and you're walking around in stocking feet. You don't want a nail sticking up because you're going to step on it and it's going to hurt. But in their culture, everything is uniform, from the kindergartner all the way through the high school student, and if you're lucky enough to go to college in Japan, through college. And that drive at social uniformity has been literally the savior of the Japanese culture. 84 million people living on one island for the last 5,000 years. That will never work inside the United States. We pride ourselves, sort of, on being different. We're non-conforming. Even though we follow fashion, fads, we want to change. We want to be our own person. We want to wear, lime green tennis shoes with a pink shirt. if we want to. Those kinds of things. And Neil, we got to take a break, but I want to get into this evolution thing that you brought up, because I think this is the real key to the subject that we're discussing tonight. Because what's happening to the human race, not just the United States, but all countries, is this integral communication that is almost instantaneous, just like we're doing right now all over the world. It is changing people. It is bringing people together. One of the statistics I found most fascinating is that almost 60% of the marriages that are taking place now in the free world, the two people met each other online. Now that's changing the world, because this little community that you're talking about, this little, Oregon, Washington, Northern California, which is a kind of a cookie-cutter community that exists all over the world, it doesn't work that way anymore. Now people in Hungary can meet people in Indiana, and people in the UK can meet people in, Florida. And they can have a relationship and communicate and share ideas. And if people can do it, then communities can do it. And if communities can do it, then states can do it. And yes, we are evolving as a people.